so the purpose of today was to bring together the early career researchers and who are part of the Centre for Biodiversity and Conservation Science. And really, we wanted to basically network to get to know each other a bit better, because I kind of felt as that it'd be nice if we can all support each other through this crazy career path that we've chosen. And also get to know more about our research. So we thought it would be a great idea to actually showcase this to everyone. So not only do we get to know each other and our research a bit better, but we also get to communicate that to the broader CBCS community, because we're all working on conservation of terrestrial or marine systems. And today we've got ECR talks from 15 people. So everyone's going to give a 5-minute speed talk. So it's going to be really short and snappy, but at least, that will facilitate further. If you're interested, then please get in contact with them to talk to them about it further. And we should have some time for questions at the end, because unfortunately, one person has dropped off because of illness. So CBCS, is really diverse from a number of schools, but today we've got people from School of Biology and School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and also our friends from QUT, Griffith University and CSIRO. So I'm just going to get started. Okay. So my name's Valerie Hagger, and I'm at the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Queensland. And I've been the ECR rep for CBCS over the past year, which I've really enjoyed. But now I'm going to be handing that over to 3 new ECR reps, Ruben, Alice, and Brooke. So I mainly do research on coastal wetland conservation and restoration, and I'm specifically interested in biodiversity and blue carbon. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of projects that I've been working on. The first one, this is an ARC linkage project with the Nature Conservancy and Healthy Land and Water, where we've been looking at what are the drivers of mangrove conservation and restoration in social ecological systems. And I've been doing this at the global scale with Nature Conservancy. So this is all the mangrove holding countries, there's about 108 of them. And we've been building a model to look at what are all the different sort of social and ecological drivers that we've hypothesized to explain mangrove degradation and loss, which has been quite prolific over the past, couple of decades. But there is hope, and, mangrove loss rates have been declining over the past decade. So we were primarily interested in looking at sort of what are the factors that influence like conservation actions and strategies at a national level, as well as also some national governance factors like corruption and democracy and economic complexity, and how that and what's the relationship between the local economic activity as well. So we've been looking at like drivers such as nighttime lights as a metric for economic activity, and also travel time to the nearest city as a metric of access to markets. And then within this, we know that mangroves, they're very dynamic ecosystems, so they also are driven by biophysical conditions. So we've tried to control for those environmental factors in our model. And the second part of this is that because obviously the model can be quite complex. So to try and, explain for factors which are not so well explained in the model, we've also done a hotspot analysis to look what are the drivers of mangrove losses and gains in each of the countries compared to like the country average. And what we found is that, it's really important to consider both losses and gains, because whilst there have been losses, there are some areas where there's been mangrove expansion, so gains. And it's those areas that we want to focus on to look at, both bright and dark spots to understand like where conservation has been effective. It's also important to look at both net and gross losses and gains, because whilst there can be a net loss, then quite often like that's not really very sensitive. And if you look at gross loss, you might get, more out of your model. It's also important to look at different time periods. As I said, there was mangrove loss was quite prolific in the 1980s, but since then the rates have declined. And also to look at a local scale as well. So we use the geomorphology unit as our local scale. And so whether it's in a delta, an estuary, open coast. And what we found that there were no positive effects from mangrove restoration efforts or national determined contribution commitments in mangroves. But we did find that There are hotspots of mangrove loss in particular, which is driven by aquaculture and agricultural expansion. And in particular, often that loss is in protected areas, which was quite surprising. And we also found that we had high mangrove loss where there's short travel time to the nearest city, so access to markets, but also high mangrove loss where there's restoration efforts. So that's quite surprising. We're not having that positive effect yet. So what this is really showing us is that community forestry and enforcing protected areas are promising strategies. And this is something I'm going to be looking at in further with my fellowship with AXA to look at community forestry to enhance conservation and restoration of mangroves for resilient coastal livelihoods. Another project I've been working on is for the National Environmental Science Program, leading this coastal wetland restoration for blue carbon. And we've done like an economic feasibility assessment, looking at tidal restoration across different climatic regions in different land use contexts across Australia. So Fitzroy Basin in Queensland, Ord River in Northern Territory, and Peel Harvey in the WA. And we've been looking at ecological as well as social co-benefits and the opportunities for traditional owner-led blue carbon projects. And we've been developing a values-based approach to select restoration sites. That's good, because I'm finished. And now we have Karlina.
I'll be talking here about some of the work that I'm doing. I'm collaborating with Martin as my main supervisor, but we're also working with others, BirdLife Australia, Bush Heritage, Accounting for Nature, Queensland governments, and the partners that are listed down there. Oops. There you go. So basically the background of our project is we question, why do we need a fauna-based community metric? So we're developing a bird community condition metric because now with conservation, initiatives are growing and we need more and more a measurement for biodiversity. But the reality is we're still using a lot of flora or plants as a proxy for biodiversity. We're ignoring the fauna when if we're just looking at flora, we're only looking at half the picture. So often fauna is neglected. And if we neglect fauna, what happens is we're only knowing half of the story. So therefore, we're starting to look at whether we can create or develop a fauna-based metric. And especially since a lot of fauna, for their conservation, we'd also need this metric as well. So out of all fauna, why we're picking birds? First, besides the fact that birds are awesome, I'm not a birder, but I can admit that. The second reason is now there is more and more data collected on birds compared. There are other faunas as well, but on birds specifically, you've got BirdLife where you can put in the data, ALA, eBird, and we're having a lot of that. That is updating and changing in real time. And for this particular project, we're using BirdLife data throughout the whole of Australia. And then, so then what comes the question, what makes a good metric? So based on plant metrics for biodiversity community conditions, we have to make sure it's replicable, efficient, and reliable. So replicable, like they can be predictable and consistent, efficient, you can implement it, it's not complicated. And also we have to make sure that experts agree on what we find with, in our research as well. So how are we achieving that for birds? For replicability, we're using clustering and machine learning techniques to ensure accuracy and predictability. For efficiency, we're using methods to ensure that they are easy to use from citizen science all the way to experts. And reliability, we're collaborating with so many experts and we're expanding this group. So every single time we have a result, we consult with them to ensure that we're getting the right patterns. Initially, we have talked with these experts and we found that 8 clusters, 7 to 8, but we're using 8 as the optimal number for clusters in birds throughout Australia. So from this, I took a sample of 40,000 observations and around 5,000 per ecoregion. This ecoregions here are based on plant communities, not birds, and we're gonna see how it differs. So a lot of these clusters that we came up with, we're still investigating what's in them. So if this question, why is it formed that way? I still can't really answer it yet, but we do know that the patterns are emerging and it has high accuracy rate, around 80 to 90% accuracy rate through machine learning, through random forest that we've been using so far. The first cluster is very ubiquitous, we think, and the second cluster is more specified. The third cluster are woodland birds, which we actually found are distinct. A paper by Fraser 2018 found that these communities are actually distinct and different. If you can see on the left, the plant communities have their own different bioregions, but for birds, they're the same community regardless of the bioregion. And for cluster 4, you see that birds are gathering in the north side over there. Cluster 5, cluster 6, we think it's mallee birds because of the specificity, small birds, insectivores. Again, another one that's different is cluster 7, which is over there in Tassie. There's a whole different community. And then you've got an interesting cluster 8 on the east side. So we know that the bird communities are different to plant communities, hence it is important to have this metric. What's next? We're thinking at acoustics and other taxa, but we're looking at this first. Thank you.
Now we have Jaramar, but she is going to join via Zoom.
Okay, well, so I'm going to talk today about making systematic decisions when we don't have a lot of data and time, and specifically talking about mangrove restoration priorities. So Valerie's talk was a good introduction. Going to give an introduction to the study area, an overview and preliminary results, as this is a work in progress. The case study is in Mexico, in the Pacific, in this protected area called Marismas Nacionales. So it is an area of 133,000 hectares, but from those 44,000 are degraded. There's a lot of interesting fauna, threatened species, lots of people living in the area, doing lots of different extraction activities. There's also urban settlements, so really complex system. So then the question is, how do we make the best restoration actions in the area? So an overview of this project. So in February 2022, we had initial conversations between Griffith University and WWF Mexico. So I forgot to mention, I am doing this research at Griffith University in collaboration with WWF. And then we identified that need to have a scientific analysis that could inform where to invest in restoration actions. March, we ran a workshop online to define what those prioritization objectives would be, following the principles of decision theory. And I think most of us are familiar with them, but in case not, just an overview. So first we need to define the problem, state objectives, define actions, identify limitations, and finally solve the problem. In April 2022, I visited the protected area and I engaged with the stakeholders and we shared some data. So these are some pictures of that. May, it was data processing and analysis. So just going to quickly run through the problem that we defined. So first, where to invest in mangrove restoration actions. That's what we want to solve. Our objectives were we wanted to identify what are those areas with the highest potential, restoration potential. And we identified 584 decision units within the protected area boundaries that were also within the geometries of the tidal systems that were previously identified for the area, and within areas with degraded mangroves. And we had these different indicators that we used to establish that mangrove restoration potential. So first, mangrove degradation level and extent, time since loss. So we chose those that were lost more recently because those have a higher potential than the ones that got lost in 1970. seeds and propagules availability to each of the decision units, flooding extent in the last 37 years, and landward migration. So that is just areas where mangroves could migrate from if they were affected by sea level rise. Our actions were based on a previous identification of what are the drivers of degradation. And that includes, sorry that some stuff is in Spanish, just restoring tidal systems, restoring sediment flows, fluvial flows, etc. And as limitations, we just use areas as a proxy and establishing 20% and 30% of the entire region to be selected. And these are our preliminary results. So on the left, sites selected at 20%, right, sites selected at 30%. And in June, we showed these to the rest of the partners that are working in this region that are here.
You're at 5 minutes, Jaramar.
Yeah, okay, that's, oh. It's just work in progress. So we are still defining what else. Done.
Okay, now we have Vicki Martin.
Thanks, Bill. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm a postdoc in seas and still a visiting fellow somehow at the Lab of Ornithology in Cornell. But today I'm talking about my current project, which is looking at mapping the different places in Moreton Bay that people use and why they value them. Now we're focusing in this instance on recreational boaters, and that's partly because recreational boating has been increasing. Oh, this isn't going forward. Here we go. No. Okay, more technical difficulties. Oh, it's just, okay. Thank you. Right, so recreational boating has been increasing quite a lot, particularly through the pandemic on Moreton Bay. And so the marine park folks are really interested in understanding a bit more about the different places that people are using and why. And it's a target group for marine park managers too, of course, because of the potential for environmental damage like boat strikes on marine megafauna and anchor damage, that sort of thing. In addition, the Moreton Bay Marine Park's just about to undergo a rezoning process. So some of this information can help inform them about areas that might be, there might be potential conflict over changes in use, or there might be areas where people have mutual interests and are more likely to support changes in some of those decisions about zones in the Bay. And let's not forget that in 10 years' time, we're going to have the Olympics being held here. So there's going to be increasing pressure on the Bay. So what we're doing, thanks to some funding from the Moreton Bay Foundation too, is we're going out and talking to recreational boaters through some in-person and some online surveys, asking them to drop pins on maps to tell us which parts in the Bay that they really value. And then they go through a process of telling us about why it is that that particular place is special to them. So they prioritize the different values, social values that they hold for that place. Now, this type of research is not new. People have been doing this sort of public participation in spatial planning kind of research for decades. As far as we know, it hasn't been done on Moreton Bay before, so that's exciting. But if we want to do this really well, we have to consider a number of challenges that I want to highlight today. If you look back through the literature, you see there's no consistent approach in conducting this sort of research. So we have a lot of decisions to make about how we want to do it. Back in the beginning, it was all a lot of paper-based research, and now we can take advantage of digital technologies, which of course have their own challenges when you're asking the public to use them. A really big question for this particular field is whose values are we measuring but more importantly, whose are we not measuring? So who is not participating in this research? It's something that we need to be mindful of, because that has issues for justice and equity, you know, further down the track when those decisions are made based on this information. Another big challenge is trying to work out what we mean by social values. So if you, again, look back through the literature, we see there's really different definitions. And in fact, when you look at the values frameworks that people have applied in this research before, what we see is actually it's really common for researchers to mix up activities. So they might have a value category called recreation with what us as social scientists would call social values. So these are the reasons why they go to a particular place. So just we need to keep in mind that, of course, these challenges, we have to grapple with them because what gets measured gets managed. And just to quickly illustrate why it's a problem to include activities in these value assessments is we can use the example of fishing. So we know that some people fish for rest and relaxation. They don't care too much if they catch any fish or not. Others might be going out to collect a feed for their family, and others still are doing it for the sport and the competition. So even within that one recreational category, we've got very different values going on, which means there could be potential for conflict over a certain area. So just to finish up, how we're overcoming some of these challenges is we are separating activities from values in our questions. We're basing our values framework based on qualitative research that's been done in the Bay by other researchers. We're testing and we're aiming for broad representation. So thank you very much.
Now we have Brooke.
Everyone, my name's Brooke Williams. I'm doing a postdoc with Jonathan Rhodes. I'm working across two projects. So one is focused on the impacts to ecosystem services from global teleconnections, such as global trade. And the other project is focused on private land conservation. So today I'm going to talk to you about one of the analyses that's most progressed, called Spatially Optimizing Market-Based Instruments on Private Lands for Conservation. So, sorry. There's just something in my way, the little floaty panel. So as we know, public protected areas alone are insufficient to sustain global biodiversity. For this reason, private land conservation is playing an increasingly important role in the preservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services across Earth. So private land conservation is where a private landholder manages or conserves part of their land for biodiversity or other conservation purposes. So private land conservation is usually facilitated through a variety of conservation mechanisms, so different types of agreements or conservation covenants. One particular conservation mechanism is called the conservation tender. So in this conservation mechanism, essentially the funding or the organizing body says, okay, we're going to invest in conservation in this region for this particular asset. And then property owners can then bid on how much they would like to receive to conserve this asset that they have on their property. And they get to choose how much they'd like to receive annually. So this sort of reverse auction, this type of payment is more cost effective and cost efficient than other mechanisms, because landowners can set their own price. They're forced to reveal the true cost of different actions, and they have a good idea about the local costs of different management actions. So it's a really useful and increasingly used conservation mechanism, but identifying the region or where to invest or put out the call for a conservation tender is a little bit tricky. So there's lots of different factors to consider. And if you invest in the wrong place or time, it can lead to wasted resources, ineffective outcomes, could also lead to biodiversity and ecosystem service loss. So the process of identifying where to invest a tender to date has largely been based on conservation values, practitioner knowledge, and it's been relatively opportunistic. So in our analysis, we're trying to solve this problem by developing a spatially explicit decision support framework to identify where to invest in a conservation tender. So essentially what the framework does is it preempts the outcomes of tender investments in different regions. It goes through the whole ranking process that a organizing body might go through. So we apply this framework to our case study, which is here in New South Wales, and it's focused on a koala-specific conservation tender. And this is in partnership with BCT, which is the organizing body in New South Wales. So on the left of this diagram, we have all of the things that we input into the framework. So we have our biodiversity values, which in this case is focused on koalas. So we have information on the distributions of koalas under current and future conditions under climate change. We have information of the probability of a covenant adoption. So this is based on data collected by Carla Archibald during her PhD. Jonathan Rhodes is developing a model that will predict for each private property the proportion of a property that someone's likely to conserve or manage, the value of the bid that they might put in, and the probability that they would put in a bid. And then economic data derived from BCT, so the cost of tenders, how much it would cost to implement. Then we also are including a deforestation risk model to essentially act as a counterfactual to say what would happen on this property if we did and didn't do a conservation action. So we synthesize all of that data and then go through the ranking process that the organization BCT would essentially go to. And then we get answers from our framework in the form of spatially explicit solutions showing where the priorities for tender investment would be. And that's 5 minutes. That's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Brooke. Now we have Richard.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Cottrell. I'm a research fellow at UTAs, also an adjunct fellow at CSIRO. So I'm really interested in aquaculture, specifically the feeds in aquaculture, because they basically cover a large proportion of the embedded environmental impacts in feeds. And I focus largely on salmon. So what I'm working on right now is the question of what we feed salmon, or where we get the ingredients from in those feeds, matter more for the overall environmental footprint of the feeds. And this work is motivated by the trend that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. So when we used to feed salmon back in the 90s, early 2000s, largely you saw that the marine proteins and oils, so fish meal and oil, were a big part of were a big component of the feed. That has shrunk significantly in the last 20 years on the right-hand side here. So plant proteins and oils, soybean, wheat, canola, things like that have largely replaced fish meal and oil in a fairly big way. Farm salmon are basically a whole trophic level lower than they used to be. So the problem is that what we see is this pervasive narrative that any sort of use of fish meal and oil, which are often taken from forage fish stocks, so things like herring, anchovies, menhaden, they're often terrible if we use them, but many of the stocks are actually managed very, very well. Compare that to some crop substitutes, less attention has been paid to them. And now, of course, aquaculture feeds are more tightly linked to land use change, eutrophication, and also freshwater extraction. So we're really interested in this particular project on if we were to feed a salmon, either a marine diet or a plant-based diet, on the right-hand side here, what happens when we start shifting the sourcing? So if we say fish meal and oil comes from the East Pacific or it comes from the North Atlantic, how does that affect the overall environmental footprint of the marine diet? And the same with the plant-based diet. If you start pulling in crops from different areas, say soybean from Brazil or from the USA or from Australia, and again, you shift around the fish meal and oil, what happens to the overall environmental footprint? So it's sort of trading off the diet versus the sourcing. So the task is to look at the overall footprint of environmental feeds, environmental footprint of aquaculture feeds. So the task is to feed global salmon industry using 2 different diets and using 3 different sources per ingredient. This is just for fish. This is an example for fish meal and oil. You might use fish meal and oil, which are co-products for 2 different diets. You might get them from 3 different places, and that lends to a different raw material demand because different species of fish convert more efficiently or less efficiently into fish meal and oil. And then using existing spatial allocation models, we will apply sort of where this demand maps in space. Once we have that, and based on the gears and things like that, the fishing gears and the species caught, we can start understanding environmental pressures. So that's just for fish meal, but we're going to do that for 50 ingredients across different diets and different contributions within those diets. For example, we might for a marine diet, we might look at the disturbance, the greenhouse gas emissions, the nutrients, the water extraction from the East Pacific versus source 2 from the North Atlantic, or a third source as well. And then we repeat that again for the plant diet on the bottom. And the hope is that we can combine all of these normalized into a complete metric of looking across greenhouse gas emissions, nutrients, water extraction, disturbance of the different diets, but also look at the variability within the feeds to try and understand what matters more. And hopefully that can inform our understanding of how to more sustainably feed salmon into the future. The other thing is we want to take this to biodiversity impact, also ecosystem service impact. I don't know how to get rid of that, but it's going to go like that. Yeah, and hopefully basically the idea is to try and understand that within versus among feed variability, a bit like you would explain at Hanover. Yeah, we're trying to see what matters more. Okay, that's it from me.
Thanks, Richard. Now we have Maria from CSIRO.
Okay. Hello. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm from CSIRO. I'm in Oceans and Atmosphere. But I'm based in the St. Lucia site. So hopefully we can build some collaborations going forward. And I know many of you from other projects as well. I'm working with Megan Saunders. I know a lot of you know from UQ as well. So yeah, thanks for having me here today. So I'm actually new to Brisbane, so I'll just give you a quick background about who I am. I did my PhD at Macquarie University in Sydney, looking at Sydney rock oysters and how they provide habitat under a variety of settings, one of those being the very modified shorelines of Sydney Harbour, which is a very different environment to kind of their natural coastal areas. And so this actually led me to then working on the Living Seawalls project for the past few years. There you go. Living Seawalls project for the past few years, which was trying to investigate how we could actually scale up eco-engineering in these very urbanized areas. So seawalls are a dominant feature of urbanized shorelines, so that they dominate most of Sydney Harbour shorelines, and we see similar issues along coastal cities around this area as well. And so the point of this project was to understand how we could actually scale up eco-engineering initiatives. So trying to see if we could improve the ecological value of these very unnatural structures. And so this was a good kind of segue to what I'm actually doing now. So now at CSIRO, I'm kind of going back into more of the classic habitat restoration sense or field, but trying to understand how do we scale up that restoration? So how do we make this restoration occur on very meaningful, large physical scales and large time scales as well? And so one of the main questions that we were trying to address is trying to understand how we can look at multi-habitat restoration. So marine habitats exist within seascapes, so connected to other habitats around them, but restoration often only focuses on a single habitat type. So in this image, you can see how there's oysters, right next to it, there's macroalgae, there's mangroves behind it, and seagrass. You can't see it, but it's in the water there. And so this is a very connected environment, and each of these habitat types are providing facilitative interactions that allow the others to persist. So we want to understand, can we use those interactions to then better design restoration that can harness those interactions and also then scale up our restoration efforts. So the goal was to build a model to kind of do this right away, but first we wanted to see what's actually been done in this space. And that's kind of where I spent the past few months looking at, where are we currently in the field of habitat restoration? So first I just looked at, where have we done single habitat restoration and across what scales has it occurred? So the scales on the x-axis are based on the Queensland DES wetland info scale, how they kind of categorize various communities in the marine space. And so I looked at whether or not, active restoration occurred. So active would be like planting or putting out substrate, or passive, which would be more of like a hydrological regime restoration. And so you can see that we've got quite a variety of scales for which restoration has occurred for single habitat types. And, some very large scale ones for mangroves and a bit smaller scale for corals. When we look at multi-habitat restoration, and there's over 2,000 examples. Multi-habitat restoration, looking at the active restoration of 2 marine habitat types, we actually only found 5 clear examples in the literature. If you all know of more, please let me know. I'm really interested to read more about them. And you can actually see that they're generally on a smaller scale than the single habitat restoration is occurring. And this is a bit surprising because we know if we look at facilitative interactions between habitat types, so we look at different pairs of habitats. So for example, salt marsh and shellfish, or mangroves and seagrass, we know there's over 100 examples of facilitative interactions occurring. So there's just this big disconnect between what we know from the kind of theoretical ecological literature, what's actually then being translated into restoration science. So now that we know kind of where we stand with what's happening, in practice, the next goal is to then actually start to understand, okay, well, how do we then scale up restoration, and how do these facilitative interactions vary if we have to vary the spacing of a restoration site? So for example, we might have this ideal system in place, but then if we actually need to position things a bit differently, depending on multi-user conflict, funding requirements, we might see a whole different system emerging. And that would actually have huge implications for the restoration success. So yeah, the next step is to understand, to build this model to help us understand how we can then better scale up restoration and harness those interactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Next up, we have Nanda. I'll just bring up your talk.
Good afternoon, all of you. Okay, first I would like to thank you, all of you, for giving me this opportunity to present my proposed research. Is that okay? Okay, sorry. So today I'm going to talk on the factors determining private landholders' conservation decision under climate uncertainty. So in this project, I'm working with Professor Jonathan Rhodes. So I'm a new postdoctoral research fellow at UQ. So okay, so more than 2/3 of the Australian terrestrial environment is owned by the private landowners. So where most of the greatest diversity of native plants and animals can be found. Thus, the conservation of the ecosystem services in the private land is basically depends on the actions and the management efficiency of the private land owners. However, less than 2% of the land which is actually designated for the private land conservation in Australia. So along with that, due to the ongoing climate crisis, or due to the extreme weather events related to climate change, the ecosystem services and biodiversity in the private land in Australia is highly, threatened by ongoing climate crisis in the recent years. So despite the government have put a lot of huge investment on the private land conservation, the uptake of the conservation covenant is pretty much low in Australia. So in order to motivate people to engage in conservation activities, so we need to know what are the factors that actually determine conservation decisions in the face of climate risks. So overall objective of this research is to predict the landholders' conservation behavior in the face of climate risk. The specific objective is to what extent socioeconomic, experiential, and psychological variables have impact on conservation intentions. Do these psychological factors actually mediate the relationship between socioeconomic, experiential factors and conservation intentions or not? So you can, what is the novelty of this research is that it links socioeconomic, psychological, and behavioral and ecological models, which interact with climate risk to determine the motivating factors. So you can see on the framework, conceptual framework on the left-hand side, whether these variables on the left-hand side will have like direct impacts on conservation intention, or it has impacts on conservation intention indirectly via psychological variables such as threat appraisal and coping appraisals. So what we are actually trying to test here, it means like whether landholders with higher threat appraisals, those who perceive risks of climate change, are they more likely to undertake conservation covenants or any sort of like conservation actions in the future or not, as compared to those landholders who have lower threat appraisal? The second second hypothesis that we are planning to test here, landholders who have more damage experience in the past, are they going to take conservation actions, more conservation actions in the future without those individuals that whom don't have like any sort of like damage experience in the past? And finally, those landholders who had trust on government's mechanism, are they going to, are they more likely to undertake conservation actions in the future or not? These are the things that we are actually trying to test here in this research. So for that, we are going to conduct like household private landholders survey in NSW. And so ultimate outcome, ultimate objective of this research is to, design a conservation mechanism which actually would cater the needs of different landholders under climate uncertainty. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nanda. We have Matthew.
Thank you. My name is Matthew. I'm a lecturer here at UQ. I've been here 2 years. And I will talk very quickly about some new work in my group and with CBCS that we're really excited about, and that CBCS has funded. And so this is a great time to introduce it. First, some background. In our group, we're really interested in ecological cascades. So those are things that when you affect one part of an ecosystem, it causes not just one, but 2 and 3 changes later down the food web. So for example, you can have different types of cascades in a forest or in a piece of bush or even in a desert. You can have ones from hunting where you have almost all the large animals wiped out. You might see an increase in small vertebrates like rodents. You have the famous trophic cascades. You lose your tiger, you get more higher abundances of these of their prey, like large ungulates. Or you can even have a bottom-up subsidy cascade. That's something where you introduce a resource subsidy like cropland nearby a forest or nearby some bush, and some animals are going to eat that. They're going to become abundant. That could lead to higher abundances of some predators, competition among the different herbivores, and all sorts of changes. So how do we study cascades when they occur across an entire landscape? We have to compare entire landscapes, and we need data on all of the players. These are all the different animals. How do you get data on dozens of animals across huge areas? Camera traps are a great method. And so we've done this in Asia. So this is a map of the sites that we have collated camera trap data from entire communities across entire landscapes in Asia. And we're able to then compare entire forests, entire landscapes to understand how these trophic cascades work. So the next step is trying to apply this approach in Australia. We ran into a big problem. The problem is there is no central database for camera trap data in Australia. If you collect camera trap data, you couldn't put it somewhere to share it with someone, even if you wanted to. It doesn't exist. So we're going to build that straight out of CBCS. We're going to create a wildlife observatory of Australia that collates whole community level data sets from camera trapping. It's going to be part of TERN, that's the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. They have observatories for things like plants. They don't have one for vertebrates. So this one's going to fill that void. And how are we actually going to get there? Well, each camera trap study produces massive amounts of data. And right now, there are people doing camera trap studies all across Australia, but they're not sharing the data and they're not publishing anywhere. So our goal is to get them to do that. And how do we do that? We're going to offer them incredible storage and processing capabilities as the carrot. And so eventually, oops, that's the wrong slide. So what that means is we're going to give them apps to make data collection easy. So when they set the camera, they can use their smartphone, take all the metadata, and it'll be standardized. Then we're going to work with Wildlife Insights, which has the most powerful AI for analyzing camera trap images, so people don't have to sort every single image by themselves. Hosted by Google, and we partner with them to power that. And then that will feed into the spreadsheets, which actually have the data we can use for analyses. And that will lead into a huge database at TERN, and will provide the easy to use resources like dashboards and data downloads and even statistical models to analyze that data properly. And so where are we on this? Well, we've applied for even more funding. We are starting to collate existing camera trap data, and we're hosting a workshop for a lot of the big groups that do camera trap in next week at Lamington. So if you or anyone you know is interested in doing camera trapping, come talk to us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Okay, we've got Ruben.
Thanks, Val. Hello, everybody. My name is Ruben Venegas. I'm a postdoc here at UQ on the GFS lab working with James Watson. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of a project in which we have been working on with a core team of the WCS headed by Hedley Grantham, which many of you probably know. So the aim of this project is, or was, to integrate the core components of an ecosystem goal into an operational framework to support planning towards achieving the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which I'll be calling GBF, milestones and goals. So the core components of an ecosystem goal have been defined as ecosystem integrity, ecosystem extent, and the risk of ecosystem collapse. So the relevance of what we are doing, or what we attempted to do here, is that ecosystem, well, the draft of the GBF as it stands at the moment has an ecosystem goal in the forefront of the framework, and it has included ecosystem integrity and ecosystem extent. The first milestones are expected to be achieved by 2030. So we need to build on existing efforts and data to have methods that can be implemented now. So very quickly, to develop this framework, we use data for the country of Myanmar, where WCS has done extensive data. So we have data on forest ecosystem type, extent, and risk of collapse. We also had data on forest integrity. And to integrate all of this data, we use a spatial prioritization analysis. First, to identify, or to assess the relative importance of a specific area in the landscape, to achieve certain ecosystem representation targets in those places with the highest integrity possible, and in somewhat connected areas, and placing emphasis on critically and endangered ecosystems. So we did the spatial prioritization using Marxan as our decision support software. And we are using the main output that we're using from the prioritization is the selection frequency maps that basically give you a measure of the relative importance of each forest pixel in terms of the objectives that we set, or the problem that we formulated. And Then we combine the selection frequency map, or this map of relative importance of an area. We combine it again with the forest integrity map to obtain this classification of each forest pixel. We did this at, I think, a 2 square kilometer resolution, in which you can see here, you can have for each forest pixel, you can see what the contribution it has to meet the objectives, the conservation objectives that it has set, that we set. And on the right, pixels that have high forest intactness. So in terms of what we're thinking, we have been calling these areas that are highlighted in those squares as critical ecosystem areas, which you can see here for Myanmar in dark blue, which is basically for highlighting the most important bits that should be considered very special in planning. So how can this support the planning and achieving the targets of the GBF? So for example, you could look at the unprotected critical ecosystem areas to inform protected area planning or spatial planning more broadly. And this is part of target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. You could also look at the integrity of those critical ecosystem areas, potentially to inform restoration efforts, which is part of target 2 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And finally, an application that this could have would be to inform investor or company decision making. For example, when to apply the mitigation hierarchy. So the results that this analysis provide can give an objective basis to understand the potential importance of an area to meet national or global goals for ecosystem in a given spatial unit. It could be used as a measure of risk in early stage screening. It could also inform avoidance and minimization. And I think that's the 5 minutes. So thank you.
Okay, now we have Catherine from QT.
Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm from Virginia in the US, which is the lands of the Potawatomi people. And that's where the Potomac River gets its name from. And really quickly, a quick acknowledgement of country. QT is on the Turrbal and Yagara lands, as well as UQ, where we are today. So pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And so I am a postdoc on the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. And so specifically, I'm in the rubble stabilization group down there at the bottom. And so that kind of begs the question, like, what is coral rubble and like, why do we care about it? So this is a nice picture of a reef. We can see healthy coral and lots of different morphologies. And so rubble is a natural part of the process. Here's a rubble patch, and this is what we call a good, localized patch of rubble. You can see the, reef structure. It's not that big compared to like a system that's rubble dominated, like this picture. And so I guess one of the key questions in that subprogram is, what causes, the differences here between having good rubble versus too much rubble. And this picture was after a cyclone, the one with extensive rubble. And so one of the main data sets we're using is the Great Barrier Marine Park habitat map from Chris Rolfsma here at UQ. And so the Great Barrier Reef is huge. It has over 3,000 reefs. And if we zoom in a bit, we can see there's 4 different classifications for this map. So of course, for this work, we're focusing specifically on the rubble, which is kind of that intermediate yellow-green, and we can see it mostly in the back reef of that bottommost sort of reef. And so key questions like, where is the rubble? How much rubble is there? According to these data is a student at QT, Tanya, is working on. And so what I've done recently is trying to predict where the rubble is. And so I subset, several thousand pixels from that habitat map, split it into training and testing data sets, and then did a whole bunch of different models, generalized linear model, a classification tree, which is pictured on the right, which kind of, classifies based on any given variable and keeps splitting until it can, predict kind of at the bottom what you would get following this decision tree. There's an element of randomness in the classification tree. So you can turn your tree into a forest by running it like 10,000 times, and you can kind of get an idea of the average of what is most, at the top of the tree versus less important kind of at the bottom of the tree. And I also ran a neural net, which is based on, modeled after the human brain and those connections. So you have your input layers, and then you can have hidden layers and your output, kind of the classic black box. We don't exactly know how it works. And so the basic formulas have, I'm trying to predict rubble, and then I first tested it with 4 different variables. And so for coral driver, rubble driver variables, I initially looked at significant wave height, wave energy density, crown of thorns sea stars, which is from the Australian Institute of Marine Science long-term monitoring program, and latitude. And of course, we're currently processing lots of other sort of spatial parameters, cyclone tracks, waves related with cyclones, bleaching, shipping tracks, etc. And so here, this is an image of a spatial interpolation of all the COTS data. So we can see there are some hotspots, so to speak, of COTS in the Great Barrier Reef. And so just with the initial model testing, we can see that across all the models, they had a fairly similar accuracy based on the confusion matrix, and ranging from 50 to 60%. And then on the bottom, the false positives did have a bit more variation, but in general, there's some initial agreement, which is nice. And then moving on from here, of course, finishing processing of the data, and then kind of just throw all of those different other variables that we're still working on into the models and consider, different limitations of the models. Like with GLMs, you have to take into account, multicollinearity, et cetera, and then potentially look at ways to penalize the rates of false positives. And then once all the modeling is done, then we can use the estimates of the models to inform a vulnerability assessment of, what drivers are more or less important for predicting where rubble is. And that is everything. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Micha, who has rejoined us at UQ.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thanks to those who organized this. For the few of you I don't know, my name's Micha. I did my PhD here, finishing up in 2020, although I'm going to my graduation tonight, so that feels like a never-ending exercise. I've recently returned here for a sort of pretty free-form 6-month postdoc with Rich Fuller in the School of Biological Sciences. And my general area of focus is around conserving shorebird habitat in the East Asian Australasian flyway. I think probably most of you have heard a group of us bang on about this long enough. So I'll just recap that the East Asian Australasian flyway sort of spans from Alaska, Siberia, northern China in the north, down through East and Southeast Asia, through to Australia and New Zealand in the south. It has the most migratory water birds of any flyway in the world, but it's threatened significantly with coastal habitat destruction. I love this little comic here talking about the challenges that birds are facing. And we do know that a significant number of species are declining pretty rapidly, and that is very attributable to coastal habitat loss. So there has been quite a lot of progress on coastal habitat in the flyway over the last 5 years. For example, we've done a lot more mapping of habitat. We now have a global tidal flat map that is free and open for anyone to use, led by Nick Murray and his team. I've done a bit of work mapping where the important artificial habitats are for birds throughout the flyway. We've recently had the release of the National Directory of Important Habitat for Migratory Shorebirds in Australia, led by BirdLife. There's also been some good news on the front of conserving habitats. For example, the site, one of my field sites in China from 2017 when I was there, was scheduled to be under concrete through a reclamation project, and it is one of the most important sites in the world for critically endangered spoonbill sandpipers. It is now a World Heritage Site. So many of the remaining tidal flats in China and the Republic of Korea are now protected or scheduled to be protected through serial World Heritage listings. And there's quite a few other good news stories as well. So that's really good news. But recently I've been sort of thinking about this idea that simply protecting the extent of habitat from major development and from reclamation is not sufficient. We need to also think about the quality of that habitat. So the last postdoc that I just did at the University of Adelaide for the last 18 months or so, we were looking at the Coorong in Adelaide. So when you look at the Coorong, it's protected in a national park. It looks really lovely, but actually it's well known to be an extremely degraded wetland system. But it turns out that answering the question, how do we measure shorebird habitat quality, is really difficult. These birds don't breed there, and there's lots of factors that affect their abundance. So just checking on their abundance is really not a good way to kind of get at the question of how's the habitat doing. So we've done a lot of work on that. We'll hopefully be publishing some of it soon. But basically the answer is it's quite difficult and complicated, and it's really important to think about. Another example, I'm glad we had some nice mangrove talks here, because I've recently co-authored a paper about the potential trade-offs between mangrove conservation and shorebird conservation. And the main message is kind of, please don't plant or let mangroves overgrow all of the most important shorebird sites, because they actually need bare tidal flats. So that's another example of where, just because we haven't built a building on it, if a site becomes completely covered in mangroves, it might no longer work for the birds. So thinking about some issues like that. The other thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that for many topics, there is a lot of good scientific knowledge out there, but there is very little translation of that knowledge into guidelines that are evidence-based, but accessible for managers. So I've embarked on quite a large collaborative project that was really cool, putting together a set of guidelines around coastal high tide habitat management into 7 languages. So I'd like to do a lot more of that type of thing. A couple of where to next, there are still some major gaps. There's some very important areas in Southeast Asia with lots of important habitat and lots of birds that we don't know much about and that aren't well protected. So thinking about how we can support colleagues there to advance their work. And finally, looking at you two, I would like to do some work on the emerging Queensland prawn aquaculture industry, and thinking about how that maybe or may in the future interact with coastal shorebirds, because we've done lots on aquaculture in Asia and very little on aquaculture in Australia. So if anyone knows any contacts in this industry, even peripherally, that we might be able to talk to, that would be awesome. We're hoping to do some workshop and some desktoping stuff on that this year. And that's me. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Micha. Now we have Alice.
Hi everyone, so my name's Alice and I'm a postdoc with Kath Lovelock, working in mangrove ecology. Now my background is actually in engineering, so working in ecology, it's quite interdisciplinary. But today I'm going to talk to you about a really small portion of a much larger project I'm working on. So traditionally my field of research is hydrological restoration, but I'm currently working on a project that's looking at restoration and connectivity of ecosystems, trying to scale them up. So this specific project is actually looking at, if I can move the slide. We got it. So we're looking at several ecosystems, so mangrove, salt marsh, tidal flats, seagrass and coral reefs, but today I'm just going to focus on mangroves. And so specifically, I'm interested in how mangrove zonation affects wave attenuation. So if we think about nature-based solutions for coastal protection, mangroves are a key player because they attenuate waves more significantly, usually, than other ecosystems such as salt marsh or seagrass. And so when we think of mangrove zonation, that refers to the discrete order in which species occur in the intertidal zone. Now, the reason this is so important is because as a coastal engineer, if we want to know how much an ecosystem can actually provide protection for communities, we want to know, number one, how much does it protect, but what is the first species that actually has the impact of the wave energy? And that's not an easy question to answer. So you might have seen from other talks today, we have a lot of mangrove maps around the world. We've got maps of mangroves, seagrass, but we don't really have any sort of global species map. So I thought I'd create one. So looking at mangrove zonation, if we know the species in an area, that's great. But what is the first species that occurs in that area? So because if we know something about the frontal species, we can know how it contributes to coastal protection. So I'm broadly answering a whole list of questions with this project, but some of the important ones are which species do we actually need to restore to get that benefit of coastal protection? Because it might not actually be a species that is naturally native to that area, in which case, is it restoration or is it habitat creation? Firstly, to kind of start tackling this question is I did a meta-analysis of mangrove geometry. So I found about 10,000 observations across 18 species. And the reason geometry matters is because not all species are equal. Some species will grow 5 meters tall, others will grow 35, and they do not attenuate waves equally. However, in published literature, species often isn't recorded. And so you'll see sentences like, Avicennia broadly reduces wave attenuation by 80%, but that's not the case in most instances. The second thing we looked at was I did a review of mangrove zonation. So this is an image of a typical zonation diagram. So it's just got the discrete order of mangrove species going from seaward to landward. And I found about 508 of those globally. And so when we combine these, you've got that small little stick diagram at the bottom. So that's actually representative of how a mangrove tree is represented in an engineering model. So the top is the canopy, then you've got the tree trunk, and the bottom is representing aerial root structure. And so even though it's quite simplistic, this is basically the best we've got. And so it's referred to as modeling vegetation as rigid cylinders. So I did start to collate this, and I made a very pretty ArcGIS story map that's available if anyone's interested in the data. And then I started to create some spatial data sets. So I've published this data set just on Pangaea for the moment, but it's just the key frontal species from all of these zonation diagrams. So it's a map of the species which take the hydrodynamic forces. And what I'm currently doing at the moment is doing an X-Beach analysis. So X-Beach is a hydrodynamic model where we can model the effect of waves in vegetation. And I'm looking at the effect of species and zonation. So when I say species, it's really vegetation architecture, the effect of zonation, maturity, density, and climatic region. And so I'm currently running about 100,000 models, and that's purely limited by computational power. But this project is also being done with salt marsh, coral reef, tidal flats, and seagrass, and then we're running them all together consecutively as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Alice. We're almost there. Second last talk.
Thank you for having me here. My name is Eli. I'm a PhD student of the School of Biological Sciences at UQ and also CSIRO. I work with Tashir, Rich at UQ, and also Sam Nico from CSIRO. So in my projects, I will work on the waterbird communities globally. We would love to see how it changes and why it changes. So I will talk about first why we need to study waterbirds. So waterbirds are species of birds that are ecologically dependent on wetland. So as you can see, they're like on the picture on the right, there's like they come in like different families, different forms, and also they have slightly different preferences and function in the ecosystem, but they are all sharing the more or less the same wetland habitat. They are very visible, and some of them also aggregate, so they can be very good indicators for wetland ecosystems health. And wetland is a very high productive ecosystem in the world, but is faced a lot of different harms from development, as we talked about in the earlier presentation. Although they're like in the past 4 decades, we have been working a lot to conserve the system and also the water birds. There's still like more than half of the water bird species in the world are still declining. So we need more effective and also more evidence to save these little wonderful creatures. So, so in my study, although I would love to do some field work, but in a global scale, it's simply not feasible. So instead, we are very lucky to be able to collaborate with some of the existing international monitoring programs, the International Water Bird Census and the Christmas bird count organized in the North Americas. So the program is about every year they will have volunteers around the world help counting the birds in December to February. So the program has been running for more than 100 years. It varies between places. So we have a very pretty good picture or data sets on the existing water births and the species and numbers over the years. So, and I will look at the data using different methods. So I plan to use this first one. It's called the species abundance distribution. So instead of like looking into changes of every single species, we will look at the water bird community and how the number of, how each species, the abundance distribute. So we will quantify the changes using a statistical model. So these are some just to show what the communities will be like. For the very first left figure, it's like most of the species occur in very low abundance, while only very few of them occur in higher numbers. And on the right, it's like we have like more species that with a higher numbers and but also some rare species. So ecologically, we say the right one would be representing a healthier community. So we would love to see like how this changes over the world over the time. And also I will look into the function diversity and phylogenetic diversity to see if they're like how the if there are any changes in the diversity over time. Are we losing some functions or certain group of water birds around the world, and see what we can do to save them. And in the other two chapters, that would be more applied. The first one would be like, we'll compare like the methods we have used in the earlier chapters and also some other existing indicators and see what would be the best way for the water bird monitoring to come up with like more effective conservation measures in the future. And we will also prioritize the actions globally and also like in different areas to come up with more effective conservation. So that's what I want to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yee. And now we'll have our last talk. And Caitie's also going to give us a bit of summary of what we've heard today.
All right. As Val said, my name is Caitie Kemple, and I used to be at UQ. I actually just started at Griffith 2.5 weeks ago, and it's my first week lecturing. So sorry if I don't make much sense. I've already talked too much today. But today I'm going to just briefly talk about what I'm hoping to kind of be my research agenda, what I focus on in my research at Griffith, which is how can Australia kind of be the gold standard for sustainable seafood and really contribute to sustainable seafood globally. Oh, am I too tall? Thanks. All right, so I've done a lot of kind of more global based seafood analyses in the past. So I'm just going to go through some of those quickly and then talk about what I'm kind of thinking about, what we might want to focus on for Australia specifically. So yeah, one of the first kind of forays into the seafood world I did was this paper that was published in 2021. That was more kind of a thought experiment, thinking about what could a transition to aquaculture really look like, since on land we saw this transition from hunting and gathering to an agricultural dominated food system. Could we see something similar for aquaculture? Could we really see a shift from fisheries to completely aquaculture dominant? And in this piece, I kind of showed how a lot of the top producers of aquaculture and fisheries products currently already are on that trajectory and going from being fisheries dominant to more aquaculture dominant. And some of these countries are also net consumers of seafood and it's not net producers. So international trade is really having a big role in where seafood is produced and consumed. And I did kind of just this thought experiment exploring what it actually could look like from a completely dominated overrun system, what like we might think about on land where we're seeing monocultures that really have completely transformed the landscape to something more integrated, and how we can actually maybe have a say in what that future looks like if we start thinking about it now and start kind of imagining things a little bit more broadly.
And another project I worked on was mapping global aquaculture. So one of the problems we have with aquaculture is it's really hard to know its impact and where we should plan to expand with increasing production, because we don't even know where it is. There's no global database. There's no reporting standards based on location or farm level standards. So what we wanted to do in this paper that a colleague at NC, Skage Clausen, led was try to collate all the information we could on aquaculture farm locations, how many farms there are, if they're producing or not, what species they're producing, and just see what information is available. So we were able to produce this map by combining all of those locations that we found and trying to model and fill in the gaps of what we thought would be needed to actually produce the production values that are reported. So we came up with this map, and we also came up with some general guidelines of what we think need to be reported along with this kind of data. Like a lot of times we don't know what species are even being produced. We don't even know if the farm is active or if it's really old and not even producing anything anymore. So we came up with some general guidelines of kind of the minimum of what we think should be reported along with this data, so we can get a better idea of the impacts it might be having and planning into the future. This is another project that hopefully I'll resubmit soon, but one of the big goals of the postdoc I did at NCEAS was mapping global food systems and its footprint across both the land and sea. And when we were starting that, it just was like a huge endeavor. So we thought we'd kind of shrink the problem down and just focus on chicken and salmon. So those are kind of two really comparable food systems on the land and in the sea. And so what we did was we mapped the cumulative footprint of those two production sectors. And here's kind of the overview of the map of what it looks like. And what we found is what their footprints actually overlap quite substantially because of what Rich was talking about, feed. So chicken get fed forage fish, salmon get fed crops. And so when you're eating those things, you're actually impacting not just the ocean, but also the land and vice versa. So there's a couple more, but I think I'm running out of time. So I'll skip ahead. So basically, I'm hoping to try to apply some of these concepts to Australian seafood. In Australia, we have fisheries, we have aquaculture, but nearly 75% of our seafood is imported. So a lot of our footprint is actually outside of our borders. So here's just a really long list of some of the things I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about trying to collate a map of Australian aquaculture, and I've started doing that from state level data and whatever data I can find online. Thinking about mapping the environmental pressures of Australian seafood and its footprint, what kind of implications these have for social, environmental, and economics, and running scenarios into the future of what could sustainable seafood look like if we change the species we consume, if we change where we get those species from, et cetera. All right, so I think that's time for me. So I just want to say thanks to everyone online for joining us and for joining us in the room. We've had a really wide range of talks, a lot of mangroves, a lot of restoration, some birds, some seafood. So it's really been great to hear what everyone is working on. I think we did basically amazingly with time, just on 2:30. So I know we don't have time for questions, but if anyone has a question for one of our speakers, we have 5 minutes? Okay. So if anybody has any questions now, pop them in the chat. If you don't have time to ask, feel free to email our speakers or get in touch with them later.